of Vietnam, when Vietnam split into two states for a while, in which they use the word Yuan a lot. Okay, so this is the first example from the time of King Naresuan of Ayutthaya, who invaded Cambodia in the 16th century. I think that this is where according to this text, King Naresuan appointed two men from his court to disguise themselves as monks in order to appear innocent and use magic to make Cambodia weaker. In this quote, and for the rest of the text, or for the rest of this passage of this episode, there's no mention of anyone being Thai or Khmer. The second example, though, I wanted to show you that the entire text is not like that. The second example, they start to talk about Thai units, the Thai army, Muang Thai, which probably was translated from Historic Thai. And so in this case, which is further down, more later in the events of the Chronicle, we start to see the ethnonym Thai, which before that was really just used to describe people. Now we start to see it being used to describe a state, Muang Thai, or an institution of the state, the army. Oh, I meant to include the quote about, or the portion about the UN also, but anyway, sorry. You can ask about it later. The third chronicle text I want to talk about now is the non-recension. It's about 100 pages long. It's more or less a complete history from the 14th century until the date it was composed. The first half is probably copied from older texts. The second half is probably certainly written. The second half is all about the period from 1750 until 1818. It's possibly all written in just before 1818, or it was possibly written at a few different times. However, throughout the text, both Siam and Vietnam are regularly referred to by ethnic terms, Thai and Yuan, many dozens of times each. And I don't see any difference in the use of these ethnic terms from the first half of the text and the second half of the text, which were supposed to have been composed at different times, which makes me suspect that that the text was at least partially revised or edited, or it was translated badly, or there were already examples of state ethnicity, references to these kingdoms as ethnic states during the composition in the mid-19th century, mid-18th century, which is also possible. However, there is a difference in the use of the ethnonym Khmer. The first half of the text does not mention Khmer at all in the history of Cambodia, while the second half of the text mentions it fairly frequently, maybe not as much as the other versions. So this is an example of using both Yuan and Khmer as state ethnicities. The Yuan army did battle with the Khmer army. They fought and fought, but no one lost and no one won. So the Yuan army returned to Stork. So this is a kind of passage that in all texts that we can see that are definitely written before the 18th century, we would not have seen states or armies described like this. And finally, there's the Baroque recension, which the copy date is 1878. I looked mostly at the new content that was written just probably before, sometime in the 1860s or 70s. There's constant use of ethnonyms in the narrative, much more commonly than in the other versions that I mentioned. The ethnonyms are used to describe internally diverse corporate entities like the Thai Army, as we've seen. They're also applied to countries, Srok Khmer, Srok Thai, Srok Yun, which you could say are using ethnonyms to refer now to places and states directly. And also, we start to see ethnonyms as autonomous impersonal characters, which drive the narrative. So for the first time, we start seeing the Yuan attacked the Khmer, or the Thai, the Thai are evil, something like that. So it's referring to, or it's like a group of ethnically defined people associated with the state who act on their own. We're not talking about kings doing actions anymore. We're actually talking about ethnic groups or the subjects of a king as a social category doing actions. So here's an example of this. All the nobles and officials, high and low, in Srok Khmer became angry. So the context is when in the 1830s and early 1840s, there was a Vietnamese governor of Phnom Penh. The Vietnamese army occupied Phnom Penh. There was a Vietnamese governor, and that governor tried to weaken the Khmer royal family and exacerbate tensions in that family, partially by capturing people and sending them away to Vietnam. Partially by persuading, partially by force, partially by capturing people and so on. So after a while, according to the Chronicle, the nobles and officials of Cambodia figured out what was going on, and this is how they felt. All the nobles and officials, high and low, in Srok Khmer became angry. They all felt that the Vietnamese governor's plot, ordering important nobles of Srok Khmer sent to Srok Yun, and capturing 4 lords of Srok Khmer and sending them to Srok Yun, that the Yuan were plotting to destroy Srok Khmer's royal family. I'd like to point out that if you look at Khmer language textbook, like history textbooks today, they're written in this style, in which states are given ethnic or national categories and act as characters in the narrative. Some people blame that on colonial France, and well, France didn't make anything any better. We can also see the evidence of this earlier. This is from a couple of years earlier than that. This is when the Vietnamese governor had a trick to try to capture a high-ranking Khmer official or something. And this time he had his 2 Vietnamese associates dress up as Khmer. And so I want to contrast that with the quote that I gave you at the beginning, where the Yutia had 2 spies dress up as monks. Actually, that was a rather common theme in early chronicles. Like, if you wanted your spies to look innocent, then they would dress up as monks. But I think it's interesting that here they're not dressing up as monks, they're disguising their ethnic identity. And I think that signals the ethnic identity meant to people a political affiliation at this point. So you couldn't be Yuan and innocent at the same time, according to this text. So the general trends that I've found and that I've tried to point out, which you could say, or which I argue, are trends in the way that chroniclists wrote about ethnic identity or made ethnic identifications in chronicles from the late or mid 18th century to the late 19th century are as follows. You see more frequent use of ethonyms of all kinds, referring to cultural groups, referring to individuals, referring to villages. as well as to referring to state ethnicity, referring to armies, referring to kingdoms. You also see, especially you see more frequent identification of state ethnicities, making an association of the subjects of the king or the hoped for subjects of the king with that state. Third, I see an identification of other state ethnicities happen before an identification of one's own state ethnicity. So in Khmer language chronicles, we see discussions of the Thai army or the Srok Yuan before we see discussions of the Khmer army or the Srok Khmer. But still, we see the latter by the beginning of the 19th century. We start to see more frequent references to kingdoms as ethnic places. Srok Khmer, Krom Thai, Srok Yuan. More frequent use of ethnic groups as autonomous political actors in the narrative, saying the Khmer did this, the Yuan did that, the Thai did this. So those are the general trends that I found. I want to just remind you, though, that I'm only looking at chronicles here. Chronicles are a genre of writing that had certain conventions. And I'm showing how those conventions changed. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people who were writing poetry or people who were having conversations would have spoken about ethnicity in the same way. So, in fact, I think there might be some evidence that they did. And I can talk about that more in the question and answer period if you're interested. And so finally, I just want to talk a bit about the relationship between what I've shown you, what I see as identifications of state ethnicity in the chronicles of the early 19th and mid-19th centuries, and the ideas of what a nation is, which people have asked me about this a lot. So I want to start off by saying that a lot of scholars commonly accept that there are certain ideals from the 20th century on, certain ideals of what a nation should be. They are never actually this way, but this is what people see them as what they should be. First, a state coextensive with an ethnic or national identity. That means Khmer people live in Cambodia. The state of Cambodia is associated with the Khmer people. The Khmer people are associated with the state of Cambodia. Actually, there's a lot of problematic, that's an ideal. There's actually a lot of Khmer people who live outside of the state. There's people who are not considered Khmer who live in the state, and so on. It's very complicated, but there's a lot of confusion about whether Khmer is a national or an ethnic term and so on. But this is an ideal. The second is that a nation is a political community in which members feel a political kinship with each other. The idea is that anyone who sees themselves as Khmer, part of a Khmer state, would have a feeling of oneness, of kinship, of relationship with anyone else who is also a Khmer member of the Khmer state. You can read more about it in a book by Ben Anderson called, what's it called? Imagine Community. So you all know it. Okay. And then third, a national territory. People in a nation feel as if they have a national territory, which is reinforced by the technology of mapping. So people can see a clear border around their country and say, this is Cambodia, or this is Thailand. So a lot of people say, okay, so what is the difference between how Khmer people view themselves and other states, the people of other states in the early 19th century, and then how they did in the early 20th century? And I would say that the identification of state ethnicity, of associations between states and ethnic groups in the early 19th century pushed understandings of social groups in the direction of these ideals of the nation already by the early 19th century, but to different degrees. I think that the first point the idea that a state should be coextensive with an ethnic or national identity, I think that that's could be the result. Could also result from constantly discussing kingdoms and institutions of kingdoms as ethnic groups, as I've shown you today. The second, a political community in which members feel a political kinship. There's not very much evidence about how people actually felt about being Khmer and who else was Khmer in the early 19th century. But we do see evidence of these elite ideas of who should be considered Khmer as affecting commoners. For example, when courts ordered peasants to round up enemy soldiers or try to capture people from enemy villages. And so I think that there might have been some developments in common people's understandings of political ethnicity, even as early as the late 18th or early 19th centuries. And then finally, national territory reinforced by the technology of mapping. Khmer likes to emphasize the technology of mapping, but there were other ways in which you could understand a geographically based ethnicity. And I've mentioned some of them today, using geographic or state-linked terms and linking them with ethnonyms like Srok Khmer might have influenced people to understand a certain geographic area or places ruled by the same bureaucracy speaking a similar language in political ways. But none of these ideals of nationhood were as commonly accepted or understood as they, or recognized as they became in the 20th century. But nevertheless, I think that the identification of ethnic groups with states in the early 19th century and mid-19th century kind of provided a foundation which facilitated nationalism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in a way that's not recognized by a lot of scholars today who see nationalism and the nation as a European import. So I'll just stop there. I'm happy to hear any, this is ongoing research, so I'm happy to hear any suggestions or corrections. I'm also happy to try to answer any questions you might have. I'm also giving my email address in case you'd rather email me, that's fine also. Thank you very much.
No, I was just speculating on what you were discussing before about the Cham.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that maybe, because at one time, Angkor controlled like such a large geographic area, and then in a way, maybe Ayutthaya versus Longfei could have been perceived as almost kind of like a civil war, among one people. But historically, you can even see on Bayon Temple, I think, like the war with the Cham. Although then I think about it and where that word comes from when people are telling you, oh, this is the war with the Cham, but the word is coming from them, it's not actually coming from the picture. But I'm just wondering if the Khmer at that time had already effectively separated the Cham as a different group because of the previous historical interaction that they had with them back in I guess that was in the 1100s or something that they had that interaction. And I'm not sure if it was religious or not. I don't know exactly the history of the Cham, but I think the Cham were not always Muslim. They were Hindu. They were Hindu before. I think they converted in I don't know what century that was. But so I mean, there might not have been a religious distinction even at that point. Was that?
Yeah. I'm reading.
Yeah.
I haven't really looked at the Aquarian period at all. And I haven't looked at inscriptions very much yet either. But I also, so it's very interesting to me how people in Angkor would have understood social categories or political relationships. I'm thinking that part of the impulse that I see in the early Chronicles to maybe avoid associating ethnic groups with kingdoms might have been because it's a characteristic shared by Chronicles from a lot of Theravada Buddhist kingdoms. So I'm wondering if this is an influence from perhaps Sri Lankan Chronicles or Mon Chronicles, or more broadly, maybe South Asian political thought that slowly subsided over time. But if that were so, then that might not have had an impact on Angkor at all. It might have come after. So I'm not sure what I would find or what we would find. I mean, maybe you will know more about the inscriptions, Angkorian inscriptions than I do. But yeah, I'm curious to know how political communities or ethnic communities were understood in these times as well.
Hi. Great talk and great work. I'm really glad you're doing this kind of work. It reminds me of conversations I had with my teacher. My teacher was Charles Kais, and he was a specialist in Thailand, but also worked on the theory of ethnicity. And he was of the school that you should only use the term ethnicity to refer to modern peoples, and which is some theory. And I always found that, I still don't totally agree with that. But I had conversations with him about it, and I asked him, how do you refer to people? And he said, well, just the peoples is fine. And in a way, his work is consistent with yours, and he would not have said that ethnicity was construction. Colonialism, that he would say was, it came in the context of modernity. And in a way that's consistent with history, because you're seeing this process toward modernity, the rise of nation state or something. It's a more gradual process, and that's what's so fascinating. Obviously, you worked in great detail about your categorizations. That it's the early ones that are interesting and more problematic, of course. That obviously they didn't use the word ethnicity or then they maybe would use the word peoples too. And in the case of the Cham and the Hui, you said, well, they were clearly not related, connected with the state. In that sense, they were ethnic groups. The question is, and I know you thought about this carefully, is how, to what extent are we, with the earlier categories, are we even projecting our own ideas of ethnicity onto the terminology when people refer to the Cham and the Hui in the earlier contexts?
Yeah, the issue of what exactly we're talking about is difficult, and I've wrestled with it. I thought about, should I be using the word ethnicity at all? And I've also found there's not a good alternative. That they're using peoples is too broad of a category because there are also a lot of references to people of certain places. The people of the capital, or the people of the hills, or something, which also could be considered peoples as well. I found that I haven't seen this in Khmer sources yet, so I'll be looking for it. But in Thai sources, there's clearly a need. By the early 19th century, there was clearly a need to talk about ethnicity in abstract terms in a lot of Thai texts, because you see writers struggling with how to talk about ethnicity without having a word for it. There's a translation of a French treaty from the 17th century in which I haven't tracked down the original French version yet, so I'm not sure if it's a translation of the word nation or race or people or what. but the Thai decided to translate it as Chat, which comes from the Pali term jati, which refers to well, in a Buddhist sense, it refers to a life, a rebirth. But in common Thai usage at the time, it referred to any sort of assumed to be kind of natural social category. So you would have the Chat category of royalty, or the Chat category of certain kind of men or women, or even of certain professions. But they didn't use that term regularly to refer to ethnic groups until they started using it in the first Thai text that I can find that uses Chat to refer to ethnic groups, which if anyone knows Thai, you know that Chat now refers to nation, is the definition of nation now in Thai. And a related word in Khmer, right, it's also used to refer to nation in Khmer. And I start to see references to using the word Thai to political ethnic categories in the late 18th century, and they become more common in the early 19th century. But we also have other words which certain writers also use to refer to ethnicity, or what seems to be ethnicity. For example, he, which now refers to gender, or pasa, which means language. And those two words are also, alongside Chat, used to talk about groups which sometimes were considered social groups, sometimes linguistic groups, sometimes political groups, which later all came to be kind of combined into the nation, the idea of a nation. So I think that while there is no abstract, for the earlier text, there's no abstract term to refer to ethnicity. There was in the later texts. I also, from the perspective of some theorists, ethnicity theorists, who prefer to see ethnicity as a very flexible or ambiguous, potentially ambiguous concept, they also use a broader definition, so they don't understand ethnic terms as only a modern occurrence. And so I agree that I don't think that there's a fine line between pre-modern and modern, in which suddenly a new set of ideas came into being from scratch. But I see it as something of a progression. And that's despite changes of regimes in Cambodia and Thailand and so on. Does that make sense? That kind of shows a disorganization.
Sure. No.
But well, the short answer is that it's a confusing. It's confusing and it's not clear. To me as much as anyone. So it's not an easy.
No, it's never been clear.
Thank you very much for the conference. It reminds me a conference given by Patrice Ladvig, a German researcher in Paris a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And it was a little bit about, but I don't remember what the corpus was. I think it was Khmer, for sure it was, Lao. It was a Patrice Lao manuscript. But I don't exactly remember the corpus. I think it was the same period. But what was interesting is that, the difference was not between state and non-state ethnonyms. It was more around Buddhist and non-Buddhist people. And the second comment, anyway, if you look at the word sasna, which is now world religion, and sa, I don't know if this distinction exists in Thai, but in Khmer and sasna and sa, or has meant for years and for centuries, not religion, not a religious group, but more, there was a notion of ethnicity also in sa, it was used in text. So the evolution you mentioned Chat, is it the Thai pronunciation? Tiet in Khmer, Jati, and Sa has also very much involved in the sense of national membership affiliation. So in the old dictionaries, especially in the French Khmer dictionaries from the beginning of the 20th century, you still have the mention of Sa as an ethnic group. So, this is another side of the
I would love to
same analysis.
Yeah, I would love to hear. I would love to find examples of that in early texts.
I can give you.
I haven't yet, but I haven't.
I mean, for the dictionary, I can give you the
Yeah, I think I have seen that.
But I think Patrice Latwig maybe published something about that. About the use of ethnonyms in, I think it was Polish manuscripts from the 19th century. Anyway, he has the text of the conference, even if he has not published them.
Thank you.
Thanks for everything. Just to jump on that, you have Prearim Chulsa, which was the name of the king of Kimpatei first, second, I can't remember. Anyway, 16th century Khmer king, but who entered Islam to basically, he married a Cham or Chfir woman. Basically, there was this idea that Chulsa meant that he was not only converting to Islam, but he was also switching and getting married into another group, and therefore, I think, to go back on Anne's idea, going into another group, whether we call it social, whether we call it ethnic, whether we call it religious, it was this whole idea, and also because he was marrying a she, he had to leave his group to go into her group, so he had to do that, and so that's from that period of time that the Khmer royal court has some Cham outfits and Cham regalia and the royal palace. And so that's one example, just to go back on the side, but also...
Say that last part about...
Sorry. That they have, so for example, the long robe that the king wears, that's basically from that time period. That's which, when the king converted to Islam, he adopted a more Cham, Malayan outfits. So in the Chronicles, it's described as Malay, but we don't know whether the woman was Cham or whether she was from another Muslim ethnic group. Basically, that was the idea. And so, but we can talk about that king later. But on the Cham case, of course, when you were wondering why they called them Cham and not referring to a specific kingdom, I was wondering because of the time frame. And I don't know, maybe I wouldn't want to add up to that later on, but the Chams were already in the country, a lot of them, and they were already making trouble, quote unquote, as the Khmer Royal Chronicles often emphasize. And so basically, as such, they might have been described as a Cham group of Cambodia. So basically, when the Cham Chronicle mentioned, oh, and there was a war with the Chams, maybe they're not talking about the Cham from outside of a border. Maybe they're probably, more likely, they're talking about the Chams within the country, but often allied with one king or one prince, and another group would ally with another prince. And therefore, you would have this tension between not only two ethnic groups, but really different little groups within those ethnic groups fighting each other, basically to have their king coming into power. And of course, the losing ones would be called rebels, while the winning ones would be just, inserted in the royal palace and within the army groups. And that's why all through the centuries, you see the Chams being very powerful and very prominent in the army in Cambodia, still now, even if they are using sometimes some Khmer names.
Yeah, I will take a look at the particular episodes you're talking about again. It is a very interesting time period when the king converted to Islam. There was also a lot of interactions with Europeans at the time as well, and a little bit earlier, I think. part of the difficulty with working with Chronicles is that because there's lots of versions of Cambodia's Chronicles, sometimes it's difficult to tell which parts of the Chronicles were written when, or rewritten when. And for the later Chronicles, the main ones used today, but the ones that are after the ones that I talked about today, there's a lot of oral history that was added to the Chronicles in the late 19th century. So using those later Chronicles, it's very difficult to tell where the information comes from, unless you can compare it to an earlier version of the Chronicle, earlier Chronicle version. But even earlier Chronicle versions won't answer every question because there were different Chronicle traditions that might have included different kinds of content. So, I mean, some of the stories that you can read about in the later Chronicles, to me they're interesting, but I'm reluctant to take them, well, I'm reluctant to use them as evidence of anything that people were thinking or wanted to say from before they were written, because I don't want to, just like I'm trying to avoid bringing my biases to looking at the older content, I also don't want biases from 20th century Cambodia to influence how I look at earlier time periods. But certainly I will take a look at both of the examples that you mentioned again, and hopefully, if I can find earlier texts that talk about, early 19th century before texts that talk about that king's conversion or about the town in general, I'd love to see it. And I've seen a little bit, but there's probably more that I haven't seen. As far as the town people making trouble, being